Right now, not 5 years ago, not 10 years ago, right now today, something is happening inside Canada's economy that could permanently change this country's position in the world. A decision worth $2.4 billion was just made. No dramatic announcement, no breaking news alert, no front page coverage, just a quiet, calculated, strategic move that most Canadians scrolled right past. But here is what is keeping energy executives in Qatar awake at night. Here is what has trade strategists in Washington suddenly paying very close attention to Canada. Here is what has government officials in Tokyo and Seoul rethinking long-term supply contracts they thought were already settled. Canada just entered a game it was never supposed to win. And the countries that built their entire energy strategies around Canada, staying on the sidelines, are now realizing they may have made a very expensive miscalculation. The global energy map is being redrawn right now in real time. And Canada is holding the pen. Stay with this video because what you are about to understand is going to completely change how you see Canada's economic future. Welcome to Canada Economy, the channel where we track the real financial moves, the real power shifts, and the real decisions shaping where Canada is heading before the rest of the world figures it out. If you want to stay ahead of Canada's economic future, subscribe right now, hit the bell, and do not miss what comes next. Because today's story is not just big, it is generational. Here is the thing about Canada that almost never gets discussed the right way. Canada is not a country searching for economic advantages. Canada is a country sitting on top of some of the most valuable assets in the entire 21st century global economy, and is only now beginning to use them the way they deserve to be used. Natural gas reserves, among the largest on the planet. Critical minerals that the global technology and clean energy industry desperately needs and cannot function without. More fresh water than any other nation on Earth. Agricultural land that feeds hundreds of millions of people every single day. And on top of all of that, a combination of democratic governance, rule of law, and political stability that resource-rich nations across every other continent spend decades trying to build and rarely fully achieve. Canada was built with every single advantage that matters most in the world right now. The $2.4 billion investment that just happened is Canada finally moving to use those advantages at the scale they deserve. The investment is focused on one of the most strategically critical sectors in the global economy at this exact moment, LNG, liquefied natural gas. To understand why this matters so deeply right now, you need to understand what LNG actually is and what it makes possible. LNG is natural gas that has been cooled into liquid form so it can be loaded onto specialized tanker ships and transported to any market anywhere in the world. Without the infrastructure to produce it, cool it, and ship it at scale, Canada's enormous natural gas reserves are essentially landlocked inside North America. They can supply Canadian and American markets, but they cannot reach the buyers in Asia and Europe who are desperately searching for long-term reliable supply right now, and who would pay significant premiums to secure it. With proper LNG export infrastructure fully built out, Canada does not just become a regional energy supplier. Canada becomes one of the most important energy suppliers on the entire planet, and the scale of ambition behind this investment reflects exactly that. The goal is not to build one terminal and call it progress. The goal is to make Canada a top 3 global LNG exporter within the next 15 years. That target would have seemed almost impossible a few years ago. Right now, given where global demand is heading and where Canada's geographic position sits, it is not just achievable, it may be inevitable. Now here is where the global picture makes this investment look even more significant than it already appears. The world is experiencing an LNG demand surge right now that has no historical parallel. And it is being driven by forces that are not going to slow down or reverse. Asia is the center of that demand story, and it is enormous. India is growing at a pace that requires massive new energy input every single year without exception. Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, Bangladesh, Thailand, these are economies with hundreds of millions of people entering the middle class right now, today, in 2025, building homes, powering factories, buying vehicles, and consuming energy at a scale that is accelerating year over year. These are not small markets at the edge of global demand. These are the markets that are going to define global energy consumption for the next 3 decades. And the fuel that lets them power that growth without locking themselves into the most environmentally destructive possible path is natural gas. Natural gas burns dramatically cleaner than coal. It is the bridge fuel that makes real economic development compatible with reducing the worst carbon emissions. These countries need LNG. They need it urgently. They need it reliably. And they need it from a supplier they can trust to still be there under the same terms in 25 years, when the infrastructure they are building today is still operating. That last requirement, reliability, trustworthiness, political stability over decades, is where Canada's competitive position becomes almost impossible to match. And then there's the geographic reality that makes Canada's position feel almost unfair when you see it clearly. Canada's west coast, British Columbia specifically, sits directly across the Pacific from the fastest growing energy markets on Earth. The shipping distance from a British Columbia LNG terminal to Japan is dramatically shorter than the route from the United States Gulf Coast. It is substantially shorter than from Qatar for most Asian destinations. It is more competitive than Australia for many of the highest demand ports in the region. Every nautical mile of shorter distance between a supplier and a buyer translates into lower shipping costs. Lower shipping costs translate into more competitive pricing. More competitive pricing means Canadian LNG wins contracts against alternatives that are simply located further away. This is not a marginal advantage. This is a structural, permanent geographic dominance that no competitor can buy their way out of, regardless of how much capital they deploy. Canada has the reserves. Canada has the location. Canada has the governance. And now Canada has the investment to start turning all three of those advantages into real infrastructure that generates real revenue and real global influence. But here is what the coverage of this investment keeps completely failing to capture. And it is the most important thing to understand about what is actually happening here. This is not an infrastructure story. This is not even really an energy story. This is a story about power, about what kind of country Canada becomes, about where Canada sits in the global order 20 years from now. When Canada becomes the long-term LNG supplier to Japan, to South Korea, to Germany, to India, what forms between those countries and Canada is not a simple commodity transaction. It is a strategic bond, a dependency that both sides benefit from, and both sides have every reason to maintain, deepen, and protect. Japan securing 30 years of reliable LNG supply from Canada is not just buying fuel. It is building an alliance around shared economic interest. Germany choosing Canadian LNG is not just a procurement decision. It is a statement about which countries it wants, anchoring its energy security for the next generation. These relationships generate real diplomatic weight. They generate leverage in international negotiations and multilateral institutions. They generate the kind of durable trust between governments that trade agreements take decades to build and frequently fail to fully achieve. Canada has long been a country with extraordinary potential as a global actor, trusted by nearly everyone, deeply respected across ideological and geographic lines, but without the hard economic leverage that turns respect into real influence. Long-term energy supply relationships change that entirely. A Canada supplying critical energy to a dozen major economies is a Canada that gets taken seriously in every room where important decisions are being made. A Canada whose strategic interests get factored in. A Canada that is not just welcomed at the table, but holds something that the other players at that table genuinely cannot afford to lose access to. The domestic economic numbers behind this investment tell their own compelling story, and they reach into every corner of Canadian life. At full build-out, projections for Canadian LNG export revenue sit between $40 and $60 billion annually. That is not money that disappears into a corporate account somewhere. It moves through the entire Canadian economy in layers that touch every province and reach every major sector. Royalties flowing to provincial governments in British Columbia and Alberta that fund healthcare systems, school infrastructure, and public services. Federal corporate taxes that strengthen Ottawa's capacity to invest in programs that Canadians in every province depend on. Wages paid to tens of thousands of workers across construction, engineering, operations, logistics, marine transport, and the hundreds of supply chain businesses that grow up around major, sustained energy infrastructure. A stronger Canadian dollar, supported by robust world-class export revenue that increases purchasing power for every Canadian family regardless of which province they call home. And perhaps most tangibly and most meaningfully for the people who need it most, sustained high-wage employment in communities that have been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. The northern BC towns whose economies have been under pressure. The rural Alberta communities watching their economic base shift. The smaller resource-dependent centres that have felt left behind while urban Canada moved on to other industries and other conversations. LNG development at scale does not deliver temporary construction employment that evaporates once the concrete is poured. It delivers multi-decade operational jobs, skilled engineering and technical roles that pay well, require real expertise, and create careers rather than just paychecks. The kind of employment base that lets a community look 30 years forward with confidence rather than uncertainty. The environmental dimension of this investment is real and serious, and it deserves a genuine answer. The concern that expanding natural gas infrastructure moves in the wrong direction on climate is held sincerely by serious people, and it cannot be dismissed. But it runs directly into a hard practical reality that honest analysis cannot avoid. Global energy demand is growing significantly right now, not falling, driven almost entirely by the developing world's entirely legitimate and entirely justified pursuit of economic growth and improved living standards for their populations. That demand is going to be met. It has always been met, and it will continue to be met regardless of what any particular government or environmental policy framework decides. The only real question is how it gets met. Canadian LNG, produced under some of the world's strictest environmental regulations, is a fundamentally different product from coal or from LNG produced by suppliers operating with minimal or zero environmental oversight. The climate math strongly favors Canadian LNG over the alternatives that actually exist in the real world. And Canada has one additional card that no other major LNG producer on Earth can fully replicate. British Columbia has some of the most abundant hydroelectric power capacity anywhere on the planet, clean electricity generated from water, and Canada is actively using that clean electricity to power the most energy-intensive stages of LNG production. The compression and liquefaction processes that generate significant emissions at LNG facilities in Qatar, Australia, and the United States Gulf Coast are being electrified using BC hydropower. The result is Canadian LNG with a carbon intensity dramatically and measurably lower than competing supply from anywhere else in the world. For European energy buyers operating under binding ESG commitments, for Japanese utilities facing government decarbonization targets they must meet, for Asian energy companies that need to justify their sourcing decisions to international investors and regulators applying increasing scrutiny, Canadian LNG is not just the most logistically competitive option and not just the most geographically advantaged option. It is the premium responsible choice, and that market position, that specific combination of competitive price, geographic advantage, and verified low carbon intensity, is something no competitor can engineer overnight. It requires exactly the combination of gas reserves, clean electricity infrastructure, and decades of regulatory credibility that only Canada possesses. The political architecture around this investment is also worth understanding carefully because it breaks decisively from the patterns that made previous major Canadian energy projects so vulnerable to legal challenge and public opposition. The investment framework was built from the very beginning with Indigenous communities as genuine equity partners, not as a consultation process to satisfy minimum legal requirements and move on, but as actual financial co-owners of the project, holding real stakes in its long-term success. That single structural decision changes everything about the political and legal landscape surrounding the project. Infrastructure, where affected communities are financial stakeholders rather than adversaries, is dramatically more legally durable. It withstands court challenges that have derailed previous Canadian energy projects for years. It survives changes in government and shifts in political climate. It builds the kind of deep community support that makes long-term sustained operations genuinely sustainable, rather than perpetually contested and fragile. If this co-ownership model proves successful here, it has real potential to become the standard approach for resource development across Canada for the next generation and beyond. That matters enormously for the long-term viability and stability of Canada's entire resource economy, not just this one sector and not just this one investment. Step back and look at the full picture of what is being built here, and what you see is genuinely remarkable. Canada is a country with an extraordinary and largely still untapped portfolio of 21st century strategic assets, natural gas in enormous quantities, critical minerals. The global supply chain for batteries, semiconductors, and clean energy technology cannot function without. Fresh water that will define geopolitical power and national security as climate change intensifies pressure on water resources globally. Agricultural capacity, feeding the world and growing more strategically valuable every year as food security pressures mount across multiple continents simultaneously. And governance quality, democratic stability, rule of law, contract reliability, that represents a premium that resource importing nations are increasingly willing to pay significant premiums to access. The $2.4 billion LNG investment is one deployment of that portfolio. But it is a critically important one because energy is the asset with the most immediate global demand, the clearest and most direct path to large-scale export revenue, and the greatest near-term potential to generate the kind of long-term international relationships that translate into lasting economic and diplomatic power. The window to establish Canada as an indispensable long-term energy partner to the world's most important economies is open right now. The contracts are being signed. The infrastructure decisions are being made. The supply relationships that will define global energy security for the next 30 years are being locked in today. Canada is in that conversation in a way it has not been before, and the countries that establish themselves as trusted, irreplaceable long-term suppliers during this specific window will hold economic relationships and global influence that define their standing in the world for 50 years. Canada is making the move, carefully, strategically, without fanfare, and at exactly the right moment in history. The global energy map is being redrawn right now, and Canada is no longer watching from the sidelines. If you want to keep tracking where Canada's economy is really heading, what the moves behind the headlines actually mean, and what comes next for this country, Like this video, subscribe to Canada Economy, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments what you think. Can Canada execute on this? Can the infrastructure get built, the partnerships get locked in, and the political will hold through everything that comes next? We read every single comment. Canada Economy. We will see you in the next one.